And this book is helpful for anyone that lived in or near Butler County, or even plans to go to Butler County. All the old roads, and it's from, what's the start? 1858 to the present. And it's a very good resource. If you're dealing with genealogy, it fits directly in there, because some of the roads that they talk about have been changed and names have gone into space, so to speak, but she did a real good job in compiling it. She told me that, on a personal note, that she had typed all the wording in the book that showed you who was where and what town was where, typed them, cut them out, and pasted them into this book. Now, this compiling, I think, is much more difficult than letting your soul run out in a book, which was her second item. And she has over here tonight, and she's going to talk about, I hope on most parts, the reflections of a grass widow. She was nice enough to send me a book. She thought I would sit down in my corner and read it now, but she doesn't know how I read. I read a bit, and then I go do a few chores, and I come back and read a little bit more. But there is a quality to this book that you do not want. Hi, Lee, sign in the guest book, if you will, right there. There's a quality to this book that is I guess every novel has it. You don't want to put it down. Once you get involved in it, you get started and you get your introduction to the characters, then it's a must to keep reading. I told her I'm pretty much through chapter 11, and that was Chestnut Ridge. I've seen her develop 4 major women characters, 2 to 3 men, and then a host of characters. Lee, there's several seats back in there. Make yourself comfortable, Lee. That you meet along the way. She's done an excellent job of bringing these to life, and some of them you want to fear, some of them you want to laugh at, and others of them you can't believe their reaction to other people's coming along the trail. It's a book that gives a very strong woman's perspective. I think that's one of the things I need to stress to you is the fact that you feel what's going through the minds of 4 women on a trip westward in the 1850s. You sit there and you think the thoughts that this lady or this lady is thinking. And then she has enough background knowledge about the terrain and the wildlife and the land and setting that she brings out the quality of Pennsylvania's varied terrain and woodland and creatures and swamps and the whole bit. I have very much enjoyed what I have read thus far, and anxious to finish it up. My wife told me tonight, why don't you put the book down and get ready, or we're going to be late getting in there. She had to shake her finger at me a little bit, but it is a very good book, and it's very real. 2 things I did with my students when I taught. One, I asked the kids, try to picture yourself as anybody, anything, even a wagon wheel on a westward trip. She has pictured these women, each in their own way, as they react to the wagon wheels and the trip over the corduroy roads and so forth. It's just a good book. I'm not going to take her fire away from her because she's got a lot of it. And Eleanor, thanks for coming tonight.
One correction. My name's Barbara. And actually, I was going to say he's done such a good job at telling you about my book. I'm going to say good evening.
Yeah. Okay, Byron, I apologize, I do this all the time.
That's okay.
That's why I'm not teaching today.
That's my feeling too, so. Yes, I do thank you for the kind invitation back. It was just the 12th of August that I was here. Was any of you present that evening? If I repeat anything that I gave as a snippet preview that night, forgive me. Because it's hard when I go to a place this close together to remember what I talked about. I, first of all, have always considered myself basically a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. That was my calling. And people ask me, how on earth did you write a novel? And I'm going to answer that question right up front. I do not know. But I will say, anybody that's involved in genealogy or in a historical society, there's going to be places where your feet will lead you that you didn't expect to go. Follow them. There's great experiences.
I'm in a meeting right now. I'll have to call you back later. Okay?
We would be asked.
This is my family members. I should introduce my husband, Richard. He's my partner in crime. I'm not allowed to write my sequel yet because when I write, I don't cook. You can tell he's suffering greatly. This is his niece, Shirley Kirk. She's up from Safety Harbor, Florida for a week's vacation. It was so nice that she just happened in Grove City for this occasion. And it's her brother, Scott. He's a resident of Grove City. And his wife is quite ill and could not be here this evening. So our thoughts is with her. Let me start. It's in the fall of 1798. There's two young gentlemen. They're brother-in-laws. And they're sitting on the back of a hay wagon. This is in Lancaster Township. And they're discussing their plight as farmers. You know, the influx of all the people from the old world made the East become very crowded. Land became quite valuable and quite scarce. And the younger of the two gentlemen, Robert, Sally Hastings' brother, was saying that since he leased his land, he could barely make a living. And he had met the love of his life, but how would he supply for her? Well, Joseph, the older of the two gentlemen, was married to Sally Hastings' sister, Rebecca. He was quite successful in his endeavors. He'd been married for a period of years, had 3 children. But he would listen and he would advise his brother-in-law. Finally, he had listened many times to the same story. So he said, you know, Robert, I hear there is land opening up in Westmoreland County. It's to be very fertile land. We could probably be much more prosperous if we would join the pioneers and move to the west. And that they did. They took many months of planning. They sat, they pooled their funds, they had the finest of wagons built. Not truly a Conestoga wagon, more like a Virginia wagon. It had been proven that it could do the mountains. It was pulled by 4 horses. They continued their plans, and between the two of them, they had decided that Joseph, because he was the senior member, would be more or less the commander of the voyage. They knew that the path and what they had heard about it was not the place for any disagreements whatsoever. And Robert, he eagerly accepted the role to be the instructor or the teacher. You have to realize that women in those days, when the men said, we're leaving on such and such a day, be ready. It was her job to have what little she could take with her packed and gather her children, and they left. They knew not what they were walking into. And they had decided that it would be much better to just each morning instruct the women what the day would encompass. Plans were going very well until Joseph's wife, Rebecca, once again, I'll remind you, it was Sally's sister, got ill. It seemed like it was influenza, but she didn't get better, and the cough worsened. And anybody involved in genealogy and history knows that at that time, consumption was one of the illnesses that our pioneers dealt with. and that's what she was finally diagnosed with. Rebecca watched as the glint in her husband's eye faded to a sadness. It appeared his wife could never make the journey. And it was in the fall of 1800, 2 years later, she said, "Joseph, we must go. We must go very quickly." Well, he looked at her in disbelief. "How can you say you can go? You're so ill." She said, "No, I have rallied." And she convinced him. And so they planned October 7th to be their departure day. Now let me take you back further in this family's history. A time when these very people I'm talking about were children, living with their parents on a farm just east of Lancaster on the old Philadelphia Pike. They were such a happy family. Sally speaks of the girls playing at her mother's feet as she would pin the clothes on the line to dry. And there among the sprigs of grass they would gather the daisies and the wild violets that grew. Robert thought this was entirely sissy stuff. So he chose to watch the robins build their nest and waited, eagerly waited, for the little babies to take flight. They were happy. They were a Christian family. Sally's mother was the daughter of a pastor. They were of the Presbyterian faith, to be exact. And as many of our pioneers were, they lived faith. It was a very important part of their life. But suddenly one day, life changed as Sally knew it, upon the death of her father. She recalls her mother taking her to her bed, and they did have a helper at their house that took care of the children. And when she emerged from the bedroom, she assured the children all would be fine. A neighboring farmer paid visit and explained to her that he understood that he had lost his wife 3 months earlier, and he would do all he could possibly do to help her. Here we had a father on one hand with motherless children, and we had a mother on another hand with fatherless children, and they very much needed each other. They were of the same faith. Everything seemed perfect. So a marriage occurred. Was there love involved? I think there came to be in time, but there was a mutual respect. Sally really, from the very beginning, did not care for her stepfather. Because let me describe Bryce to you. Very, very intelligent man, successful farmer. But he was the type of a personality that did not ask, be ordered. And that Sally did not like. So as she grew older, not too different from some families today, when Bryce would enter the room, she exited the room. And in Bryce's defense, he sold these 2 farms and he bought a large farm in Donegal Township. In fact, the farm was in the general location of the Cameron estate. And I don't know if any of you have been to see the Cameron estate and the Donegal Presbyterian Church of 1760s. Most beautiful location in Pennsylvania. And I have to get my thoughts back where I left off. So in defense of Bryce, he was able to give his family most finery that any family would want, including a private library. He built a large 2-story home. And so Sally had found her solace. She didn't want to be around her stepfather. She would enter the library, pull a volume of poetry, and sit and read, eventually taking her quill and her paper and putting her words on paper, learning how to rhyme them. And she envisioned herself to someday be a famous poetess. At the age of 15, she met the man that she felt filled the vacancy in her heart. A man named Enoch Hastings. He would walk the long farm lane and they would sit on the side porch. And just as young people do, they would talk for hours. Never ran out of things to talk about. He had the right things to say to impress her. They would hold hands and walk down to the little town of Maytown that still exists. There were some 19 log cabins. They would walk the streets, stop at the center square, take the community dipper, and have cold water from the well. Well, her parents very much disapproved of this relationship. That mattered not to Sally. She invited Enoch to come up and see her church, which just sat north of the farm. And it was there on the banks of the spring behind the church that Sally received her first kiss. So there's a little bit of a love story to my novel. She explained that she had feelings she never before felt. And of course, when Enoch said to her, "You are just like a fresh flower waiting to be plucked from its stem," what 15-year-old girl wouldn't fall for that line? But what you need to know is Enoch was 60 years old. Now you know why the parents disapproved. Her stepfather said, "Sally, you are making your bed." But they slipped away into the little town of Maytown and they married. And Enoch took her to a home very near the square that he had never mentioned that he owned. And there they set up housekeeping. In a few short years, Sally describes that she found herself as round as a pumpkin. And she had her first child. And the night the midwife arrived, Enoch walked out the door, never to be back. And it was that night that Sally found that she was a grass widow. She knew not where he was living. She did not know with whom. But as time went on, he would pay visits, and she knew from her faith that women were to be submissive. And she felt submissive was submissive. She would pray that this was not the night that he would choose to stay. But it's evident that 2 nights he did stay, because she had 2 more children to this man. As she would take her little children out of the house to gather her water from town square, she noticed the women in town. There's that grass widow. And they would look at her in disgust. And she understood not, what have I done? I raised my children. I'm faithful. Finally, it was her pastor that told her, "Sally, unfortunately, my message has not got through to the people, because in our culture, women are despised when they are left without their husband. Now that can be deserted or divorced. After all, what's wrong with you women that you can't keep your husband at home?" Now one woman, when I had my question and answer session, said, "No, that wasn't it at all. She was a mighty young girl, and these women was looking at her like she would come and take their husbands." I don't think that was the case, because if you study back, that is what a grass widow was. This year, I was at the expo that our genealogy group had in Butler, and a man from Texas approached me. And he says, "Madam, I hate to tell you, that's a Texas term." And I said, "Well, possibly it is. But I hate to tell you, it's a Pennsylvania term." It was an old term, grass widow. There was also sod widows, women whose husbands were dead. They were called sod widows. They were not despised in the same way. So Sally lived a very lonely life. Not one friend did she have in all of Maytown. But her mother never deserted her. Her mother became her best friend. And so the day the 2 brothers approached her and said, "We are going to go to the West, and Sally, we need you. We need you to be your sister's nursemaid for the rest of her life. And you can certainly fill the bill." She did not know how she could go, but her mother said, "It is best. It will put my mind at peace to know that both of my daughters are bettering their life." Now, when you take my novel in your hands, it's a two-parted book, because in the back of the book is the actual journal that Sally wrote as she crossed the mountains on this voyage. And it was the second paragraph of her journal that somehow or other touched my heart, and I knew that this young girl had a story far beyond what was in this journal. And I'm going to read it to you. She wrote in English prose. She wrote much like our forefathers wrote, and I have republished her complete journal, except I have removed the cumbersome F's. For instance, if you've never read English prose, possess would be spelled P-O-F-F-E-F-S. Well, you start reading a chapter of these F's and you're like this, you know. You will notice in her journal all the nouns are capitalized, the punctuation's very different. That was Sally's writing, just as she wrote it. But in the second paragraph, she said, "You, madam, can better imagine than I describe the variety of feelings which agitate my mind as the moment approaches which is to separate me from my tiny infants. Yes, madam, compelled by strong necessity's supreme command, I am commencing an exile from my native home, my family, and all my heart holds dear on earth, with the humble intention of seeking among strangers that sympathetic friendship to which a child of misfortune has ever a claim." Now, from what I just told you, she is making an exile. She is going for another reason. She is hoping to find friends, to find a normal life among strangers, because she considered herself a child of misfortune, a child that had disobeyed and now was laying in her bed. So, October 7th came. She speaks of getting up that morning, and although her mother and her father had 7 slaves on this large farm. At first, when I wrote my book, I didn't know quite how to describe the fact that the people in the East had slaves. You can call them owned people. The Christian people of the East, when they had slaves, it was not like Southern slaves. It was totally different. And in fact, Donegal Township was among the forerunners of emancipation of the slaves. There was a year that came that every baby that was born from their 18th year on would be freed. So they did not treat them like lowly slaves, although I guess that's a proper name for them. Her mother got up early that morning. She fried the bacon and baked the biscuits. And they had the large table in the kitchen, and it was to be their last meal together. They all sat, the conversation flew around the table. It was warm, till suddenly it became very quiet. They knew the time for approaching was near. Sally decently decided that she would be last in line to say her goodbyes. As they lined up, they hugged their mother and father and said their goodbyes before they boarded the wagon. Sally had promised herself she would not cry in front of her children. So she hugged her 3 children, her mother, and even her stepfather, the man that she never really knew. And there was only 3 words she could say to each of them: "I love you." She crawled in the wagon. The wagon lumbered very slowly from the lane. She said she looked back until she could no longer distinguish their facial features. And it was then she looked at Rebecca and said, "I can now cry." Her sacrifice, a lot of women cannot understand. How could she be her children? It was not easy, and that's the reason I'm bringing that up tonight. As you read this, it was a difficult decision. In fact, to further enhance how she felt, I want to read you a few lines from my novel. Sally wrote, "I chose to linger here at my home for a few moments, wishing to reflect on personal memories, all which were important to me. Re-entering my home, I viewed the house with a newfound sense of reality. How very small were the rooms. The wooden planks on the floor appeared worn from the many footsteps. The grout between the logs was blackened from the smoke of my cook stove. Nothing of beauty has this place offered. My bedroom was no larger than a mere 9 or 10 feet, but held many of the memories of my lifetime. My wedding night, the birth of my 3 children, and countless lonely nights. Climbing the steps to the second-floor bedroom, the room shared by my children, I questioned myself. Why had I never before noticed the steepness of the steps, or the windows so small they let for little light to enter? Of course, my children voiced no complaints, as they knew no different. This was a little haven in which each night I lovingly tucked them into their beds. I choose to stand in prayer for my babes, their continued health and happiness in their newfound world. Mother Embrace's world offers them more opportunities than I could ever afford. I exited a rear door leading to the backyard. There the garden tools stood leaning against the wall, just as I had left them. How should I forget the many blisters suffered from these implements? Winter shall tend the remnants of my garden. The old fence was in dire need of repairs. The buckets remain just outside the door. No longer shall I fetch the water from the hand pump in town square. I moved back inside to take one last glance from the front window. It was there, on the front street, I had witnessed the unfriendly ladies of town, and many a tear was shed as I stood at this very spot. Exiting to the front, I stood in reflection. Feeding a strong compulsion, my thoughts were said aloud. In saying adieu to Maytown, even though you pious ones are not before me and hear not my words, I declare to you self-judging ladies, you are about to lose your chosen grass widow. Turning, I closed the door and blew a kiss goodbye to my home of the last 12 years. It was the very next morning after that breakfast that they left, traveling due north, right along the Susquehanna River. Now, I brought a map with me tonight. If you want to take a moment, you can see what the route was. The route is also in maps in my book. After 7.5 miles, Joseph had the team of horses stop and said, everybody out, stretch your legs, get a drink, time to rest. Ordered the slave couple that was with them to water the horses. There were 10 in all among them on this trip. I'll review once again Joseph and Rebecca with consumption, and their 3 children. There was Robert and his new bride, Elizabeth. There was Sally, and then the slave couple, Hetty and Eb. In a few moments, Joseph said, okay, it's time to continue. I want to tell you right now, we all have to take our fair share of walking. Our horses cannot long endure pulling such weight. And our spirited little Sally said, now you tell us, now that we've left the farmland. It was that day Sally learned that women were not asked for their opinions, and their opinions were not appreciated. So as you read through the novel, anything you see in italics were thoughts that Sally had in her mind. It was better left unspoken. They stayed that night in an inn, which Sally described having ample beds, food pretty much like what they had at home. She decided it wasn't bad at all. It was merely a long walk, because it was 17 miles. The next morning they got up and continued on. And day after day, that's what they did. They never knew what the day was going to encounter. They stayed in inns, taverns, and private lodging homes. Some were better than others, and maybe I should have worded it backwards. Some were worse than others. Rarely did they all have beds. They learned the trick of sleeping sideways in a bed you might get 6 in. The children usually always slept with blankets on the floor. Often the slave couple would sleep in the barn. But it was Sally's duty to give complete care to Rebecca during this voyage. And you are right, Ed, it is pretty much a story in a woman's viewpoint. But these women were not on this trip without these 3 men. These 3 men had duties beyond belief. From the moment they woke up to the time they went to bed. They had to manage to control this team on this muddy path of tree stumps and rocks. They had to protect them from danger of wild animals and possibly Indians. They worked from morning to evening, and when they finally did stop, the work wasn't done then, because the men had to jack up the wagon, take off the 4 wheels, grease the hubs, tend the horses, brush the horses, cover the horses, milk the cows. Unbelievable. They didn't stop at the motel and have a sandwich from McDonald's. Just didn't work that way. The trip itself took 24 days. The first Sabbath day, they had no intentions of traveling. They had felt that if they would rest the Sabbath, they would be blessed with much easier travel, that they would need that day of rest. But unfortunately, they got up that morning, and the place they were lodging was full of drunken men. Now, many of the wagoneers that took people back and forth on this path were the most drunken men along the way. And that particular morning was very uncomfortable for this family. So Joseph had met with them, and he said, "We are continuing to the next quiet house." They did not have an easy day that day because it rained, and the trail or the path became very muddy. And it was that evening, at the end of the day, when Sally got Rebecca down in bed and resting, that she sat down, and in her journal, she wanted to write to her dear mother. Now, when I mentioned Madam before, her mother was the Madam. She respected her mother to the point that that is how she properly addressed her. She took her pen and she wrote, "Dear Mother, where do I begin?" She woke to find herself still seated at a small table, her head lowered on her arms, lost in reflection. She had fallen into sweet slumber, her letter left unwritten. The next morning it was up and at it. Onward they went. And I'm referring to my pages here, so please forgive me until I find them. It was October 15th. It was the 9th day of travel since they left home. They arrived at a little place called Moore's Tavern. I want to get my little bowl over here. And as I said, Sally was busy taking care of Rebecca. Elizabeth and Hetty was taking care of the children. The men were work with the animals. But by 5 o'clock, everything was done. And in the room walks the landlady, promptly at 5 o'clock. Now, this little place had not much to offer. It offered one wheel, which served as a dining room table, an equal number of chairs, benches for seating. And promptly at 5 o'clock, the landlady walked in and said, "Supper is served." Well, Sally looked. She didn't recognize the smell. She didn't recognize what it looked like. And in her proper fashion, she says, "Madam, can I ask you the flavor of your porridge?" "Well," she says, "you proper folk. If you must know, it's calf's head soup." Sally knew not what to say. Well, could we please have a loaf of bread and some butter? No, ma'am. Calf's head soup. And she promptly left the room. They all were seated on the benches, and Joseph looked at them. He could read the expressions on the faces, and he took his spoon, and he dished up some for each person. He took a spoon and he said, "Eat this. It will warm your body and give you strength for tomorrow." Well, Sally knew that it was her responsibility to see that Rebecca would eat. And she coaxed, and she coaxed, and she managed to eat 1 cup of the porridge herself. She said, "I'm so cold, and I'm so hungry, but can I partake?" She looked how the men was eating with no hesitation at all. Well, I wonder if they work harder at this than we do. She come to the conclusion, in words unsaid, perhaps we ladies are indeed the fairer sex. This is one of the examples of how, when they were so tired and so hungry, they accepted what they could get. They did meet some very unusual people. And when you were a traveler, you was thrown into every class of society. And if you was a girl that lived in the better class of society, there was life's lesson to be learned along this trail. There was another day that Sally chose to write her mother. You know, the reason for her writing this journal to begin with was her mother's request. She so much wanted to share with Sally's children what was going on. In some way, Sally had intended to get this journal back to her mother if she could find a courier to take it. But on this particular evening, they are staying at Snake Spring. And she sits down and she says, and this is a direct quote from her, "Mother, as you read this account, you may take my word for it. To exaggerate the description of this terrific wildness of this country would require the efforts of a genius far superior to me. But tonight, in my state of exhaustion, I drop the pen and I acknowledge myself incapable of no higher service than that of the laziest animal." Sally describes as they're nearing the end of their voyage, and she describes the towns that's still there today: Carlisle, Shippensburg, Bedford, Ligonier, Canonsburg, Greensburg. She names all these towns and she describes them. But she also says, "My brothers no longer stand so erect. They are stooped. Their beards are tangled, their hair is long, their clothes are tattered." But they didn't give in. None of our pioneer families that came to this country caved in, so to speak. They came to this country for 2 things. They wanted land to raise their large families, and they wanted freedom to worship God as they chose without persecution. Sally did succeed at becoming a known poet. But most of her poetry was very, very hard to understand. I have to admit, I cannot understand much of it. But there was one particular poem that I did decide to include in between the 2 books, and it's called My Prayer. I did not include the whole thing because it went on forever. But I picked out the verses that I felt talked directly about this voyage. And I felt not to include that would be an injustice to Sally, but it'd also be an injustice to you as a reader. Because I hope by the time you're done with this story, you're going to feel like you know Sally. Was she a woman libus? Maybe a little. She had had to learn at a very young age to stand on her 2 legs and be self-sufficient. And no man had really told her what to do ever in her lifetime. I feel she was a remarkable young woman. And on the back of my book, I write, at the very end, that upon Sally's passing in 1812, she was laid to rest in an unmarked grave. Rest assured, if you enter the churchyard in the spring of the year, it is there you will find the robin singing its praise, while the butterflies flutter among the wild flowers, marking her final resting place. Sally Hastings was a lady who will not soon be forgotten. And it's to her that I dedicate my book. Of everything I have ever read, there is not one account of what our forefathers endured when they came to the West, and I'm speaking of Western Pennsylvania, that was quite like her story. Her gift at writing poetry let her have the adjectives to describe things. Now, for you serious historical readers, why did I change it to a novel? Because not 1 in 10,000 people would take this English prose and work their way through it. I'm one of the crazy ones that did. And I mean, I've read it and read it and read it. I still find things every time I read it. So I decided that starting chapter 4, where they took their voyage, I would date my work just like Sally did, October 7th. You can go back and read October 7th in her journal, which are short little entries. Come up and read October 7th as I wrote it. Now, most of it is made up from her account. I quote some, I paraphrase some, I did other research, I have inserted that, and then the rest is my crazy imagination. One that I hope the story is good if you're age 15 or if you're age 100. So I hope every one of you that is so disposed will enjoy the story. I think that if you close your eyes and envision these characters, maybe you'll see your grandmother and grandfather crossing the mountains. So I'll take any questions you have. Yes.
Where did the journey end?
In Cross Creek Township, Washington County.
And what was the year they started?
1800,
18.
yeah. Just off a little bit, 1800. Yeah. So it's back a ways. Yes.
And what did they do after the journey ended?
They had a farm. Now, certain questions that I'm usually asked, there's some of them that I can't answer because there is going to be a sequel to this book. It takes a great deal of research. And although a novel is not 100% fact, a historical novel has a great deal of fact in it. So I have pretty much book 2 up here outside of putting together some research to back up things. But certain questions I can't answer.
Anything about the 3 children afterward? And her mother?
Book 2.
Okay, fine.
Book 2. That's a main question I can't answer. Yeah, about her mother and 3 children. And people usually ask about Rebecca. Is nobody going to ask about Rebecca? Rebecca did live through the trip. She did survive the whole 24 days. Why did they leave in October? Because it did run into snow on this voyage. The only thing I can think is with consumption, I would think your breathing would be much easier in the cooler weather than the heat of summer. And possibly the inns were not as crowded, I don't know.
Maybe they had to get through their farming season.
Possibly.
Get everything set up to go.
Possibly.
Easier too, the ground is cold and hard.
But it wasn't, it rained.
There's no really
Oh,
cold.
it just
So when Ed Carlson said about the corduroy roads, we were studying that, and we was talking about the stone house, so I had the corduroy roads and how people slept sideways.
She gives you a different look at taverns. You know, when you get down to Stone House, it's so neat and prim and looks so nice.
Yeah.
But as she goes from each boarding house to each tavern, each one of them has a different picture that you get, and you wonder how in the world women came across and survived.
definitely. Many of the boarding houses literally didn't have beds, or they were so crowded that they slept on the earthen floor. And although these landlords or landladies were prepared to give them coverings, everything was done in mass. They ate together, sometimes in shifts, depending on the size of the place. They slept together, they bathed together, and they changed clothes together. And so the proper ladies did not bathe and change clothes often. And oftentimes, if they were wet from the day's travel, they would simply wrap this warm covering around them before they lay on the floor. Many times they were bearskins, and they were ridden with fleece. But it was warm. No, it wasn't such glorious travel. But they were a strong, strong breed of people. And like you mentioned, you'll shake your head at some of the circumstances, and of course I'm not going to give them all to you for two reasons. I don't have time to ever tell you everything, because I will guarantee you every chapter is packed with different instances, different circumstances that they were experiencing. And the other reason is I want you to read the book, of course. But you will just shake your head and you will smile in places. I think there's even a place or two in the book that you will have tears, especially the ladies. Now, a good friend of mine made it to chapter 2. And I said to her, well, how's it going with the book? Because she's not a reader. She said, I got to chapter 2, I'm in tears, I laid it down, I can't read it, not right now. Well, there's nothing in chapter 2. I was just astounded, and I said, what in the world is in chapter 2 that made you cry? She said, the grass widow. I said, well, that's just a fact. And she says, no, my mother, she had 11 children. My father walked out. We moved to the poorest section of town. Not one neighbor would speak to my mother. This is in our generation. And she said, it made me cry, because I could feel what she was going through. So I had another instance. I know I'm taking too much time. I asked anybody, do you know what a grass widow was? And of course nobody said a word. And one little head peeped up. And I said, oh, you know, ma'am. And she said, no. And that particular evening, I had taken the young woman with me that did all the illustrations in the book. They're all hand-drawn. And while I was selling books and signing for people, I seen my illustrator sitting at her feet. And they were having quite a conversation. So we went out for pie afterwards, and I said, well, Susan, you really had a nice conversation with that lady. And she said, you just wouldn't believe it. She said, she's writing her memoirs. And she had been struggling with how to tell her children what her life was like as a mother. And she says, now I know what I am. I was a grass widow. So that although these were not my intentions when I wrote this, it was more for the historical value of the journal. This is how it touches everybody in a different way. So I thank you, Ed, for the...
You haven't covered for the audience how you found this, where you found this
No, I didn't.
document.
I'm sorry. Well, I found this whole document by getting my first computer. My husband retired in '89. I bought a computer. I learned how to turn it on. Now what do I do with it? Really had no idea. But I like to type. So that year for Christmas, my children brought me Family Tree Maker. Pretty much a word entry program. Type in what you know, and I soon found out I didn't know anything. Not much about our family. And I was researching. I am fair to say I have, 15 volumes just stuck full of papers. I have a tremendous amount of stuff. And I realized that not all my children shared my enthusiasm. In fact, a daughter-in-law said to me, I'm much too busy to chase dead people. And that was her view of it. And I looked at what I was gathering, and oh yes, Isaac married, and he was born such a date and married, her name, they had this many children, and they married this lady, and they had this many children. And I thought, this really is boring stuff. So I decided I would write 2 or 3 chapters before my genealogy work to try to convince my children the value of what was on the pages. Well, our family, I had no Civil War letters, no family Bibles, nothing of any interest. So I went to the genealogist at the Butler Library, and she's very gifted, and I said, Lou Ann, is there anybody that came across the mountains in 1800? Because that's when our Morris and Isaac came across. And she said, yes, Sally Hastings. I said, good, where's her work? And she said, oh, it's in spatial collections. You'll have to go to Clarion State University. Now, I don't know if Grove City has a copy in the college. But the librarian handed me this little brown box, and she said, be very careful, it's fragile. And I opened it, and it was fragile. It was a little thin leather brown book, not as big as this, probably this wide but this high. The pages were brown and brittle, but all intact except for a half a page, and it was in the poetry section. My husband's a very patient man, but when I saw it was English prose, I thought, uh-oh, he's not going to sit here all day while I learn how to read this. So I copied the whole journal. I thought I would take it home and transpose it. Well, I soon found out it's easier to learn how to read it than transpose it, so I didn't do it. And like I said, when I got that journal and I started to read it, paragraph 2, the one I quoted you, is the one that said, this girl has a story to tell. And the more I read, the more I realized her story was really there. So, did I ever get the genealogy done? No. I've got waylaid. So, that's how I found the book. In fact, I was telling my family at supper, her journal would never probably have been known, except a man found a copy at a flea market in Lancaster County and paid 3 cents for it. And in the front of her journal, it tells you who the subscribers were. In other words, the editor of the newspaper that printed this gathered subscriptions, and most of them were Presbyterian families in the East and in Washington County, and a few friends and whatnot. And I believe, if I remember correctly, there was 176 or 178 copies. And occasionally you'll see one on Amazon.com, $1,300 to $1,900. So they become very valuable. And that's why I felt people deserve to be able to have this and just read it at their leisure. Because it will definitely put your mind's eye where it needs to be so you understand what you're researching. How many's doing genealogy here? A few? You know what I'm talking about that. You get lost, you know. We can't find my husband's, what is it, great
somebody.
2 or 3 greats. 2 or 3 great grandfathers. And he's just disappeared. Possibly buried along the trail. Many of them did not make it.
He's probably dead.
But you know, then you're thinking, well, that was only 1780 or 1760. And your mind starts to forget how long ago you're working. It's like it's yesterday.
Sally, have you had any contact with the genealogy associated with her?
Yes, I have. I had the blessing of emailing. I've not met her. It would be the great-great-granddaughter of Robert, the younger brother I spoke of, that is actually Sally's brother. And she shared quite a bit of information with me. She has some handwritten letters that Robert had written back to his mother. I have quite a bit of information that I can pull from for very factual information. But amazing enough, we went to Washington County a couple weeks ago. Here is the county that named Sally their county poetess. Way back, about 1810. And not a soul knew of her, ever heard of her, knew not a thing about her. And I was at the Historical Society. They knew nothing about her. Yes.
When they started this journey, did they have a destination in mind, or?
Yes, they did, Cross Creek.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
They had a house there that they were going to, that they had purchased. Okay. So any other questions? If not, let me thank you again. And I'm going to pass the fishbowl around. This evening, I forgot to prepare my door prize. Remember last time I had a door prize? Was it here that somebody said, is it a door? No, it wasn't a door. So what I'm going to do tonight, instead of a door prize, is whoever gets this gets $7.50 off the purchase of a book. So I'll let you pass it around and fill out one of the slips. I'm glad I didn't break it when I slammed the book down.
Thank you, Violet, for being
Yes.
our guest. Violet will be here afterwards to answer any other questions you might have. And she does have her books over here, and they are for sale, and I think it's
$18.95 is $20.09 for the time we pay the government.
$20.09 for the governor, okay. And so if anybody'd like to have purchased, she also has an excellent hand, she'll be glad to autograph them for you. If you'll just make yourself comfortable, we have our cookies, and I have to go get our punch, so everybody help themselves, and we'll go from there. Come back again next week.
That's a good
And
idea.
just featuring sections of your museum, and I think they'd probably love it.
Well,
Might build up your membership. I don't know, they could be much help to
in the
you.
future, because of the steps, older people probably won't walk the stairs to see our displays on the second floor. So to make it handicap accessible and age accessible, we bought that camera there and another camera. We would like to digitize every item we put in a room, and then make it into a little script or a little film or a disc, and
Oh, see,
so
that'd be
people come in
nice.
here and say, I'd like to see what you have on display on the veterans. Well, here's our display.
Wonderful.
And that way, there's a wheelchair entrance, and they can come right in through the kitchen, right into here, or even at the table at the kitchen. So we have 17 rooms up there.
Some of the historical societies I get into of towns, even larger than this, have no ideas like you have.
We have a very creative society, a society that's willing to go a little bit out on the limb to accomplish a whole lot. That room back there is just amazing.
I would have never guessed till I walked in there. It brings back memories, because my mother, the stove she had was not quite that old, where the gas pipe come across the front was a little more refined, and it was a green color. And then Shirley was from Florida, her father had a large house in Butler, and he converted it to an apartment.
They started here.
Yes, well, due north.
right here,
She mentions Cannonsburg, graduation day, Cannonsburg. And things haven't changed that much from then till now. If you want to really get down to nitty gritty, because she had one sentence only about a political matter in the book. And I thought, oh my gosh.
Illustrations that could be beautiful, it could be beautiful. I want to tell you something. I came across a little lady that was a friend of my traveling buddy, archery buddy, that loved to paint, loved to draw. And she was tremendous with wildlife. And I said, I'm going to put together this